She always arrived before everyone else. At 5:40 in the morning, when the corridors of the Montero Braga building were still immersed in that cold silence of marble and glass, Renata was already pushing her cleaning cart through the hall on the 30th floor. She was 26 years old, but her eyes carried the weariness of someone who had lived twice as long. She wore a navy blue uniform twice her size because it was the only one that could hide her 6-month pregnancy. No one there knew she was pregnant. No one there even knew her name. To the executives who passed by at 8 or 9 in their dark suits and with their coffees and thermal mugs, she was just a peripheral movement, something that happened at the edges of their field of vision, like fluorescent light or the hum of the air conditioning. Renata cleaned the tables, emptied the trash cans, wiped the glass separating the meeting rooms, and at no point did she raise her eyes when someone entered. Not out of submission, out of habit. She had learned over the years that certain people only notice you when you get in their way. So she moved like a shadow, efficient, invisible, punctual. Sometimes, during the 11 o'clock break, I would sit on the cement bench behind the building near the service exit and eat a bread roll with margarine that I brought from home wrapped in aluminum foil. I would rest my hand on my stomach, look at the sky between the buildings, and take a deep breath, as if trying to convince my own body that everything will be all right. Then I would go back. I always went back. Rafael Montero Braga was the kind of man magazines call a visionary. He inherited a group of companies from his father and, in 6 years, tripled his net worth. He was 34 years old, with dark hair, a calculating gaze, and a loneliness he disguised very well with endless meetings, business dinners, and trips that lasted long enough so he didn't need to sleep at home. His penthouse apartment in Jardin was 200 square meters and had a view that anyone would call spectacular, but Rafael almost never looked out the window. He lived in the office. He arrived early, left late, and in between, ran the company with an almost surgical precision that hid something he would never admit aloud. He didn't know what it was for. The money was so plentiful that it no longer meant anything. The success was so continuous that it no longer caused any emotion. Rafael had everything one could buy and nothing that can be felt. Sometimes, in the middle of a meeting with investors, he would catch himself looking at the corner of the room where the cleaning lady was mopping the baseboard, and he would think, without understanding why, that she seemed more present in that room than any of the men in suits sitting at the table. It was an absurd thought, he knew. Then he would blink, return to the subject, and forget about it. Until one day he couldn't forget. It was a Tuesday in August, around 7 in the evening. Rafael had stayed late to review contracts alone, something he did when anxiety got the better of him, and he needed some kind of control. The office was empty, or almost. As he walked towards the elevator, he heard a muffled sound coming from the meeting room at the end of the hall. He stopped. It was crying. Low, restrained, almost swallowed, as if the person crying was trying to prevent the sound from escaping. Rafael approached slowly, without knowing exactly why. The door was ajar. Inside, sitting on the floor next to the cleaning cart, was Renata. She held a crumpled piece of paper in her hands and cried with her face turned down, her shoulders trembling in short spasms. Her belly was now visible because her uniform had ridden up when she sat down. Rafael stood at the door for 3, maybe 4 seconds. And in that short silence, something stirred within him. Something he couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity. It was a kind of recognition, like when you see someone carrying a weight you also know, even if the weight is different. He knocked lightly on the door. Renata looked up in surprise, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and stood up quickly, apologizing in a broken voice. "Sorry, sir. I was just finishing up. I'll be right there." Rafael didn't say anything for a moment. Then he spoke, in a voice softer than he himself expected. "No need to apologize. It's all right." She didn't look at him. She picked up the cart and walked down the hallway without looking back, leaving the crumpled paper on the floor. Rafael looked at the paper. It was an eviction notice. The address was a neighborhood on the eastern outskirts. The name on the document was Renata de Souza Oliveira. He folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, and stood there, motionless, for longer than made sense. The next day, Rafael arrived early. He told himself it was because of the contracts, but he knew it wasn't. He wanted to see her. Not romantically, not consciously. He just wanted to observe, to understand who this woman was who cried alone on the floor of a meeting room and then got up and continued. She was there, as always, wiping the tables. He greeted her as he passed. "Good morning." Renata almost tripped in surprise. She looked at him with wide eyes, as if that good morning was a mistake, a system failure, something that simply didn't happen. Then she replied, almost in a whisper, "Good morning, sir," and she continued cleaning. Rafael entered his office, but left the door open for the first time, without knowing why. From that day on, Rafael began to pay attention to things he had never noticed before. He realized that Renata never used the main elevator, even when it was empty. That she brought her own cleaning supplies from home when the office supplies ran out, so as not to bother anyone. That she never ate lunch in the cafeteria with the other employees. preferring to stay alone on the fire escape. He noticed that she limped slightly on her left leg at the end of the day, probably due to the weight of her belly combined with the hours spent on her feet. And he noticed, with a discomfort that grew each day, that no one else noticed. In a board meeting, he casually asked if the cleaning staff received the same benefits as the other employees. The HR manager frowned and said that the cleaning staff was outsourced, that it wasn't their responsibility. Rafael nodded and said nothing more, but something hardened in his chest, something that had to do with shame, not of others, but of himself, for never having asked before. 2 weeks later, on a Friday night, Rafael did something he himself would consider absurd if he stopped to think about it. He followed Renata, not premeditatedly. He was leaving the office when he saw her walking towards the bus stop on the avenue, her steps tired and her bag slung over her shoulder. Something inside him told him to follow her, not to approach her, just to find out where she was going, how she lived, who this woman was outside that navy blue uniform. He drove off and followed the bus. He felt ridiculous, he felt intrusive, but he didn't stop. The bus continued for 40 minutes to a neighborhood Rafael had never visited. Streets of uneven asphalt, poles with exposed wiring, houses of exposed brick, a bakery with peeling paint on its facade. Renata got off in front of a narrow 2-story house with a side cement staircase. She climbed the steps slowly, holding her belly with one hand and the rusty handrail with the other. When she reached the door, someone opened it from inside. Rafael, parked on the other side of the street with his headlights off, saw the scene through the crack in the door. An elderly, thin woman in a wheelchair extended her arms to Renata, and Renata bent down with all the difficulty of her pregnant body and embraced the woman with a tenderness that crossed the distance and hit Rafael like a punch to the chest. He couldn't move for a while. He stood there, in the dark, inside the car that cost more than that entire house, and felt something that money could never buy, the exact measure of his own insignificance in the face of something real. In the following days, Rafael couldn't be the same. He attended meetings, signed contracts, answered emails, but something was off. He looked at the spreadsheets and saw the face of that elderly woman in the wheelchair. He looked at his colleagues and realized, for the first time, how everyone there was incapable of seeing what was happening 2 meters away. One afternoon, he called the manager of the outsourced company and asked for information about Renata de Souza Oliveira. The manager found it strange, but provided it. Renata had worked at the company for 3 years. She had never been absent. She had never complained. She received minimum wage and had no health insurance. Her mother, Dona Conceição, had been paraplegic since a traffic accident 4 years ago. Renata was solely responsible for her. The child's father, according to the few records, was not listed. There was a note in the system saying that Renata had requested, 3 months earlier, a 1-week leave to care for her mother after hospitalization. The request had been denied. She hadn't been absent. Rafael hung up the phone, stared at the office wall, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, perhaps since his own mother's death when he was 17. He felt the urge to do something that wasn't for profit, strategy, or results, something that was simply because it was right. But he didn't know how to approach her without seeming condescending, without seeming like the boss who suddenly notices the employee out of pity, without seeming like the millionaire who distributes crumbs to ease his own conscience. Rafael was intelligent enough to know that the distance between them was an abyss, and that any miscalculated gesture could humiliate her more than help her. So he did something unusual for a man accustomed to solving everything with money. He waited. He waited for an opening, a moment, a natural opportunity. And she came. It was at the end of September on a day of heavy rain. The storm had flooded several city streets, and traffic was at a standstill. Almost all the employees had left early. Rafael was in the office when he heard a noise in the break room. He went there and found Renata sitting on the floor, her hand on her stomach, breathing with difficulty. Her face was pale. She looked at him with the kind of fear that isn't of being seen, but of needing someone. He knelt beside her without saying anything. Then, carefully, he asked, "Can I take you to the hospital?" She shook her head. "It's not the hospital. She's like this sometimes. She kicks and I get dizzy. It'll pass." Rafael sat on the floor beside her. The two stayed there, on the cold break room floor, while the rain beat against the windows and he said nothing and she said nothing, and that shared silence was, in some strange and inexplicable way, the most honest conversation Rafael had had in years. After a few minutes, Renata stood up with difficulty. He stood up too. She said, without looking at him, "Thank you." He replied, "You don't need to thank me." And then, without thinking, he added, "I know about the eviction." Renata froze, her eyes filled with fear and anger at the same time. "How do you know?" Rafael hesitated. "Because I saw the paper, that night, on the floor of the meeting room." She took a step back. Her face hardened. "And what do you want with that?" Her voice was harsh, not out of rudeness, but out of protection. Rafael felt the weight of her distrust like a wall. and he understood that he deserved it. "Nothing," he said. "I don't want anything. He stopped. He didn't know how to finish the sentence without it sounding false. Renata picked up the cart and left. He stood there with the incomplete sentence hanging in the air and knew he had done wrong. I couldn't enter her life like someone entering a company. I couldn't buy her trust effectively. Renata didn't speak to him for 2 weeks. When he passed by, she lowered her head and quickened her pace. He felt this like a wall he himself had built when crossing a boundary. He felt like the man he was, someone who, even with good intentions, didn't know how to deal with the fragility of others because he never knew how to deal with his own. He thought about giving up, about letting it go, about accepting that there are abysses that money digs and that no amount of goodwill can fill. But then something happened that changed everything. One morning in October, Renata didn't come to work. For the first time in 3 years, Rafael felt a pang in his stomach that frightened him. He called the outsourced company. They said she had informed them that her mother was hospitalized and that she needed to be absent. They also said that if she was absent for more than 2 days, she would be let go. Rafael hung up the phone and, without thinking twice, got in his car and drove to the neighborhood where he had seen her that night. He found the 2-story house. He went up the stairs. He knocked on the door. No one answered. He knocked again. A neighbor appeared at the window next door and said that Renata was at the municipal hospital with her mother. Rafael went there. The hospital was a gray building with crowded corridors and the smell of disinfectant. He found Renata sitting in a plastic chair in the emergency room corridor. Her belly was enormous, her eyes red, her hands trembling. Next to her, on a stretcher against the wall, Dona Concepcion was breathing through an oxygen mask. Renata looked at Rafael and, for a moment, said nothing. Then her eyes filled with something that wasn't anger, wasn't gratitude, wasn't relief. It was astonishment. The astonishment of someone who didn't expect to be found, of someone who had carried everything alone for so long that the mere presence of another person seemed unreal. Rafael didn't offer money. He didn't say he would solve everything. He didn't make promises. He pulled up a plastic chair and sat beside her, and he stayed. For 2 hours, he stayed, without saying anything that wasn't necessary. When the doctor came and said that Dona Concepcion needed surgery that the public health system, SUS, would take months to schedule, Rafael saw the face of Renata collapsed like a wall of sand. She held her mother's hand and said, in a firm voice that concealed immense despair, "Everything will be all right, Mom. Everything will be all right." Rafael felt his heart beat in a place he didn't know existed. He left the hospital without saying anything. The next day, Dona Concepcion was transferred to a private hospital. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Renata received a call informing her of the transfer and was confused. She asked who had authorized it. They said it was a procedure covered by a new hospital partnership. Renata wasn't naive. She knew it had a name, and that name was Rafael, but there was no trace, no signature, no card, no message. He had done it in a way that didn't demand gratitude, that didn't create debt, that didn't put Renata in the position of owing something to someone more powerful. He had understood, and that understanding was the first thing that made Renata truly look at him. The surgery was a success. Dona Concepcion was discharged 10 days later and returned home with physiotherapy follow-up. Renata went back to work. On her first day back, she passed by Rafael's office, stopped and said, looking him in the eye for the first time, "I know what you did." Rafael held her gaze. "I didn't do anything that anyone should have done." Renata was silent for a moment. Then she said, "You are the first person in a long time who has done something for me without wanting anything in return." And she left. Rafael stared at the empty door and felt, for the first time in years, that he had done something that mattered. Weeks went by, and something changed between them. Not dramatically, not with grand declarations or gestures. It changed in the details. Renata started saying good morning without him needing to speak first. He started leaving a glass of juice in the break room in the morning, on the shelf he knew she used without saying it was for her. She started cleaning his office last, taking a little longer, as if she wanted to be in that space for one more minute. He started finding reasons to be in the office after 6 when she finished cleaning. Sometimes they would cross paths in the hallway and exchange a short phrase, a comment about the weather, about the traffic, about nothing. Important, but those nothings were everything. They were the first bricks of something that neither of them dared to name. But the world is made of glances, and not all of them are kind. Rafael's secretary, Monica, an efficient and territorial woman who had worked for him for 5 years, began to notice. She noticed the juices. She noticed the schedules. She noticed the glances, and she didn't like it. One morning, while Renata was cleaning the meeting room, Monica came in and said, in that polite voice that is the most refined form of cruelty, "Renata, right? You're spending too much time on this floor. I think you should rotate with the other teams." And she added, looking at her belly with a thin smile, "Besides, in this condition, perhaps it would be better to ask for leave. The company doesn't need labor problems." Renata didn't answer. She lowered her head, picked up the cart, and left. But the hand holding the cart trembled, and her eyes burned with that kind of tear that doesn't fall because you don't allow it. That night, at home, Renata sat on the bed next to her mother and said, "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." "Ahas, Dona Conceição," her voice weak but firm, held her daughter's hand and replied, "It's always worth it, my daughter, because we don't do things for what we receive. We do them because of who we are." Renata rested her head on her mother's shoulder and closed her eyes. And in that moment, with the noise of the neighbor's television coming through the wall and the smell of burnt rice coming from the kitchen, she felt, for a brief and precious instant, safe. Rafael knew what Monica had said. Not because someone told him, but because he knew Monica. He knew that kind of petty power wielded over those who can't fight back. And he felt a silent anger, not explosive, not theatrical, but cold, precise, the kind that comes when you realize that the system you built allows things like this to happen. He called Monica into his office and said, without raising his voice, "If you make any kind of comment, direct or indirect, to any cleaning staff member in this building, I will terminate your contract, not as a threat, because I don't want to work with someone who uses their position to belittle others." Monica's eyes widened. She had never seen Rafael speak like that about someone who, in the building's hierarchy, wasn't even... It existed. She left the room without saying anything, and something in Rafael's expression made her understand that he wasn't bluffing. November arrived, and with it, São Paulo's false winter. That damp cold that seeps into your bones without asking permission. Renata's belly was enormous. She worked with increasing difficulty, but she didn't complain, never complained. One afternoon, while cleaning the window in Rafael's office, she sat in his chair to rest for a moment. He entered and found her there, hands on her belly, eyes closed, her face contorted with an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. She opened her eyes and made to get up. He said, "Stay, sit, rest." She hesitated. Then she stayed, and he sat in the guest chair on the other side of the desk, as if he were the guest in his own office. And there, in that silent inversion of worlds, Renata told for the first time the story she carried. She recounted that the child's father was a man she met in the neighborhood, that he promised all the things men promise when they want something, that when she told him about the pregnancy, he disappeared, that she searched, sent messages, waited, and never heard from him again, that her mother had fallen ill soon after, and that she had to choose between the pain of being abandoned and the urgency of keeping everything afloat. She said she had worked since she was 15, that she had never had a vacation, that she had never traveled, that she had never been to a restaurant. She recounted these things without self-pity, without drama, with the same firm voice she used to say good morning every morning. And Rafael listened. He listened like he had never listened to anyone before, not to respond, not to solve anything, just to receive. When she finished, he didn't say, "I'll help you." He didn't say, "Poor thing." He didn't say anything that diminished what she had lived through, turning what was, in fact, a testament to strength into a problem. He simply said, "You are the bravest person I have ever met." And there was something in his voice that Renata recognized immediately, because it also existed in hers. Loneliness, the loneliness of those who bear the weight of existence alone. From that day on, the wall between them completely crumbled. Not with a bang, but silently, in the same way that ice melts when the sun persists without haste. Renata was still cleaning the office. Rafael was still the building owner. The difference in class, money, and worldview remained enormous and undeniable, but inside that room, when the door was closed and the outside world wasn't looking, they were just two people who had discovered, in each other's presence, a place where they could stop pretending. Rafael told Renata about his mother, about how she had died of cancer when he was 17, and how his father never spoke about it, never cried, never hugged his son, only plunged deeper into business and waited for time to do the work he didn't want to do. He said he inherited from his father not only money, but the habit of replacing affection with efficiency. He said he married once, at 27, a woman who loved the idea of being the wife of a rich man, and that when he tried to show who he really was, she looked at him with boredom and said she preferred a public husband to a private one. The divorce was quick, clean, and absolutely devastating. Renata listened to all of this, and in the end said something that no one had ever said to Rafael. "You're tired too, aren't you?" And he felt his eyes burn, and he looked away, and swallowed the lump that rose in his throat and nodded silently, and she didn't insist. She just stayed there, and that simple presence was the most expensive medicine he had ever received. In December, during Christmas week, Renata felt contractions in the middle of her workday. Her water broke in the bathroom on the 30th floor. A colleague from the cleaning staff found her and called for help. Rafael was in a meeting with investors from Hong Kong when he received the news by phone. He stood up in the middle of the presentation, excused himself, and left. His partner looked at him, confused. His secretary tried to stop him. He didn't listen to anyone. He went down to the ground floor, found Renata already being put into an ambulance, and told the paramedic, I'm going too. Between contractions, Renata looked at him with eyes full of pain and something that seemed like a mixture of fear and relief. Rafael held her hand inside the ambulance, and she squeezed so hard that she left marks on his fingers. He didn't let go. At the hospital, while Renata was being taken to the delivery room, Rafael stayed in the hallway. He walked back and forth. He sat down. He stood up. He leaned his head against the wall, and he realized with a clarity that frightened him that he was more afraid than he had ever been in any negotiation, in a crisis, at any point in his life as a successful man. Because, for the first time, something he couldn't control mattered more than anything he could. The baby girl was born at 11:47 p.m., 2 kilos and 900 grams. Healthy. Renata cried when they placed her in her arms, and it wasn't the office cry, restrained, swallowed, hidden. It was an open, wide, full cry, the kind of cry that is also laughter, that is also relief, that is also the sound of someone who has finally arrived somewhere after walking barefoot for a long time. When Rafael entered the room, she was holding the baby to her chest, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes swollen, and he thought, with a certainty that needed no explanation, that he had never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. He approached slowly. He looked at the baby. Then he looked at Renata. She said, "Her name is Aurora." He repeated softly, "Aurora," and smiled. And she smiled. And in that hospital room, with fluorescent light and cheap cotton sheets, something happened that neither of them had planned and that neither of them could explain. The world became the right size. In the following days, Rafael arranged for Renata to stay in a better room, but he did so through the hospital, without a card, without a signature, without a trace. When she questioned it, they said it was protocol for first-time mothers. Renata knew it wasn't, but she accepted it because she was too exhausted to fight, and because, for the first time, accepting help didn't feel like a defeat. Dona Concepcion came to see her granddaughter at the hospital. A nurse pushed the wheelchair to the room, and when the grandmother held Aurora in her arms, Renata saw something in her mother's eyes that she hadn't seen in a long time: a future. Rafael appeared at the hospital every day. He brought coffee, fruit, books that Renata would never have time to read. One day, Dona Concepcion looked at him for a long time and said, with that frankness that only the old and the very courageous possess, "You like my daughter?" It wasn't a question. Rafael felt the blood rush to his face. He looked at Renata, who was busy changing the baby's diaper and pretending not to hear. Then he looked at Dona Concepcion and said, "I like it." The old woman nodded, as if he assessed the harvest and said, "Then take good care of it, because it doesn't need another person adding to its problems." Rafael took those words home and spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling of his 200-square-meter apartment that had never seemed so empty. He thought about what it meant to truly like someone. Not the kind of liking for elegant dinners, for matched profiles, for social conventions. The kind of liking that springs from seeing someone on the ground and wanting to sit beside them. The kind of liking that asks for nothing in return. The kind of liking that accepts the cleaning cart, the townhouse in the suburbs, the 6-month pregnancy, the eviction notice, the burnt rice, the mother in a wheelchair, and doesn't want to change any of it just to be there. He thought that never, in his entire life as a rich and powerful man, had he been as courageous as Renata was every day simply for existing. And he felt shame, and he felt gratitude, and he felt something that seemed very, very much like love. When Renata returned home with Aurora, she found the house different. The walls had been painted. The bathroom had been renovated. There was a new crib in the bedroom and a wheelchair ramp at the entrance for the mother. There was no card. There was no receipt. Renata sat on the bed with the baby in her arms and cried again. And Dona Concepcion, from the living room, shouted, "Stop crying and go feed that girl." And Renata laughed through her tears, and Aurora, startled by the noise, began to cry too, and Dona Concepcion began to laugh. And in that renovated house on the eastern outskirts of town, 3 generations of women did at the same time what women do when life gets tough and then gets easier. They lived. Renata had to make a decision. She couldn't indefinitely accept help from a man who, officially, owned the building where she cleaned bathrooms, not out of pride, out of dignity, because she knew that the day the help turned into dependence would be the day she lost the only thing she'd ever had, herself. So, when she returned to work, she went to Rafael's office and closed the door. He looked at her and knew from her expression that the conversation would be serious. She said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. She continued, "Everything. What you did for me and my mother, I will carry with me for the rest of my life. But I can't be the cleaning lady the boss helps. That puts me in a place where I can't look at you the way I want to." Rafael felt his heart race. "What way?" Renata looked at him with those eyes that carried all the weariness and all the courage in the world. "As an equal," she said. "I want to look at you as an equal. And I'll never be able to while I'm here, cleaning your desk, receiving your help, living in the shadow of what you give me. I need to leave. I need to find something else. I need to be able to reach you my way, not yours." Rafael was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I understand." And it was true. He understood. He understood because that was exactly what he admired in her, his fierce refusal to be diminished, even when the diminishment came disguised as kindness. Renata resigned from her job at the outsourced company. With her severance pay and a small amount of savings, she enrolled in a nursing technician course. She chose nursing because during her days at the hospital, with her mother and later with Aurora, she had seen how a calm touch, the right word, a firm presence could change a human being's state. And she knew how to do it. She had done it her whole life. But no one had ever called it a profession. The routine became brutal. She cared for Aurora at dawn, left the baby with her mother in the morning, went to classes, returned at noon, worked as a housekeeper in 2 homes in the afternoon, returned at night, studied, slept 4 hours, and started again. It was inhumane, but it was hers. Rafael and Renata continued to see each other, not in the corridors of the Montero Braga building, but in a small cafe near the subway station, in a public park on Sundays, in a square where Renata pushed Aurora in her stroller. The meetings were simple: coffee with milk, a park bench, conversation about the day. Rafael was going without a driver, without an expensive watch, without the weight of his last name. And there, in those common spaces, without hierarchy, without marble, without a social and service elevator, they finally were what they wanted to be. 2 people who chose each other every day, not out of necessity, but by decision. One Sunday while they were walking through the park, Renata suddenly stopped and said, "I need to tell you something." Rafael felt his stomach clench. "What?" She took a deep breath and said, "Aurora is Gabriel Montero Braga's daughter." The name hit Rafael like a lightning bolt. Gabriel was his younger brother, the brother who lived for parties, who spent his inheritance on trips, who collected women like one collects bar glasses. The brother Rafael had financially supported for years because their father had left most of the inheritance to the eldest son, and Gabriel never forgave him for that. Rafael felt the ground disappear beneath him. He looked at Renata. He looked at Aurora, sleeping in her stroller, her cheeks rosy and her fists clenched. And suddenly he saw what he should have seen from the beginning: the shape of her face, the arch of her eyebrows, the shape of her lips. Aurora had Gabriel's features, the same jawline, the same crease between her eyes. Rafael sat on the nearest bench and remained silent for a long time. Renata stood there, waiting. She didn't explain herself. He didn't apologize. He simply waited, with the same dignity with which he faced everything. When Rafael finally spoke, his voice was low and trembling. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Renata replied, "Because I didn't want you to take care of me out of obligation. Because I didn't want this to be about him. I didn't seek him out. He sought me out. When I was working at an event for his company a year ago, he was kind. I believed him. When I told him about the pregnancy, he said I was lying, that I wanted money, that it wasn't his. He blocked my number. He disappeared. I never asked him for anything, and I would never ask you." Rafael felt an old anger towards his brother, one that came from a long time ago, from years of accepted apologies, tolerated failures, forgiven selfishness. But along with the anger, he felt something stronger, the certainty that none of that changed what he felt for Renata. None of that diminished who she was. None of that transformed Aurora into anything less than she already was to him. He looked at Renata and said, "I don't care whose daughter she is, I care who takes care of her. And you're the one who takes care of her. And if you let me, I will too." Renata looked at him for a long time. And in that look there were years of distrust, of fear, of promises broken by other men, of doors that closed, of hands that let go. And there was also, fragile and new as a plant that has just broken through, the earth, the possibility of believing. She didn't say yes. She didn't say I love you. She reached out and held his hand. And they stayed there, sitting on the park bench, with Aurora sleeping between them and the December sun filtering through the trees. And that was enough. Rafael sought out Gabriel. He found him at an expensive restaurant, having lunch with friends, laughing loudly, with the kind of nonchalance only someone who has never been responsible for anything can have. Rafael sat at the table and said, in front of everyone, "You have a daughter. Her name is Aurora. Her mother is a woman worth more than anything you've ever touched. You will legally acknowledge this child, and you will never again approach their lives unless they want you to." Gabriel turned white. His friends fell silent. Gabriel tried to deny it, but Rafael placed a folder on the table with documents, recovered messages, dates, records, and he said, "If you prefer, we can settle this in court." Gabriel swallowed hard and signed the acknowledgement the following week. Not out of love, out of fear. But for Renata, the result was the same. Aurora would have a name on paper. She would have rights. She would have what the law could give, since her father couldn't give her anything more. The months went by. Renata finished her nursing course. She got an internship at a children's hospital. Dona Conceição, with her health stabilized, cared for Aurora during the day with the help of a neighbor whom Renata paid with her internship salary. Rafael remained present, but always at her pace. He never offered what she didn't ask for. He never imposed a solution she didn't choose. And this patience, this listening, this respect for the other's time was the rarest and truest form of love that the two had ever received. One Saturday in March, Rafael took Renata to a restaurant for the first time in her life. It wasn't an expensive restaurant. It was an Italian trattoria in a middle-class neighborhood, with checkered tablecloths and melted candle wax in the wine bottle. Renata was wearing a dark blue dress that Dona Conceição had helped sew. She was nervous. He was too. They sat at the table and were silent for a moment, the kind of silence that happens when two people know something is about to be said. Rafael looked at her and said, "I'm afraid." She asked, "Of what?" He replied, "Of not being enough for you." Or Renata almost laughed, almost cried. The idea that a man with that money, that power, that name could feel inadequate in her presence was so absurd it seemed like a lie. But she looked into his eyes and saw that it wasn't a lie. She saw that his loneliness was real, that his fear was real, that his wound was different from hers, but it bled the same way. And she said, "I'm afraid too, but it's the kind of fear I want to have, because it means I'm alive, that I'm choosing someone, that someone chose me." Rafael held her hand on the checkered tablecloth and felt that this simple gesture in an ordinary restaurant was worth more than any contract he had ever signed. Aurora took her first steps on a Sunday in July, in the backyard of the renovated house. Renata filmed it with her cell phone. Dona Conceição clapped from her wheelchair. Rafael was there. Aurora walked towards him, stumbling, with open arms and that smile of someone who doesn't yet know that the world can hurt, and he picked her up and lifted her into the air, and she giggled, and he felt in his arms the exact weight of everything he never knew he needed. Renata looked at the two of them and knew, in that instant, that life owed her nothing more. That everything she had lived through, every humiliation, every sleepless night, every closed door, every hand she let go of, had been the path that brought her there, to that backyard, to that man, to that child's laughter in the winter air. Months later, Renata was hired permanently at the children's hospital. That same day, she received a letter. It wasn't from Rafael. It was from Gabriel. 2 lines, handwritten without elaborate apologies. "I was wrong. If Aurora ever wants to meet me, I'll be here." Renata kept the letter in a box, along with her daughter's birth certificate and the eviction notice she once clutched in her hands on the meeting room floor. She kept everything together because it was all part of it. The beginning and the present, the pain and the relief, the cold floor and the sunny backyard. That night, after putting Aurora to bed and helping her mother lie down, Renata went out to the side staircase of the 2-story house. The air was cold, the sky was clear, and between the buildings and the power lines, she saw a star, just one. She didn't make a wish, she didn't need to. Life had already given her what she never dared to ask for. Not a perfect life, but a real life, with someone who saw her when she was invisible, who sat beside her on the cold floor and stayed, who never tried to save her because he understood that she never needed saving. She only needed to be seen. Rafael arrived shortly after, climbing the stairs with 2 cups of coffee. He sat down beside her on the cement step. They both remained silent, gazing at the same star. Then he said softly, "Thank you." She turned her face away in surprise. "Why?" he replied. "For letting me stay." Renata rested her head on his shoulder. And there, on that cement staircase in the eastern outskirts of São Paulo, with the smell of coffee mingling with the cold night air, 2 worlds that should never have met proved that life doesn't follow rules, that love doesn't ask for an address, that dignity is priceless, and that sometimes the most shocking secret someone can discover by following a pregnant cleaning lady after work is that the richest person in the story was never him.